as we journey through our lives in this big, small world. As we journey through our lives in this big, small world.
Let's do it.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for waiting. It's 9 minutes past 3, which means it is time to take a look into the future. Welcome to this live stream of Eindhoven University of Technology. Welcome to Heroes and the Future, our online symposium to celebrate the 65th anniversary of our university. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you're watching, at home, at work, at university. We look forward to 2 very interesting hours with you, in which we will address some of the pressing challenges and outlooks of today and the next 65 years for our society, for science, and for technology. My name is Marle de Jonge. I am a program organizer of our university's Studium Generale, and I will do my best to guide you through today's program and make sure that your views will also be heard. Because we might not be in the same physical space, unfortunately, but we are going full out to connect with you digitally. Now, before I introduce you to our program and our wonderful set of speakers, for the opening of this event, I would first like to give the floor to the President of the Executive Board of Eindhoven University of Technology, Robert-Jan Smits.
Good afternoon, everyone. We all want to know what lies ahead of us, what the future will bring. We know about climate change and its devastating impact. Just we know that we are abusing our planet big time. And the COVID-19 crisis has shown us how vulnerable we are, and that there will be more infectious diseases coming our way. The question is whether technology can bring us solutions to the enormous challenges our planet and we as human beings are facing. Or, on the contrary, whether it will accelerate our problems and drive us in full speed against a brick wall. And will we in future be able to control the technology we are creating? Or will artificial intelligence, AI, take over and reduce humans to a subordinated species? Will life in future still be defined in the same way as today? Or will it get a completely new meaning? And when we talk about the future, are our societies willing to prepare for tomorrow and bring sacrifices to allow a future for next generations? The challenge we have given to our speakers is utterly unfair, I realize that, but at the same time it's inspiring. Tell us what will come our way, and not just for tomorrow, but in 2086, when the TUE will be celebrating its 130th anniversary. As we all know, the TUE is holding this symposium as part of its 65th anniversary, a special year which we are celebrating now, and it has been given the overarching theme, Heroes Like You. I'm therefore very grateful that 3 impressive heroes have agreed to speak at today's symposium, and would like to thank them on behalf of all of us. Enjoy the lectures. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert-Jan. Indeed, what will come our way? It's an ambitious question, but certainly the focus of discussion today. First, take a moment to realize, though, how much science has changed our lives in the past 65 years. We have solar cars now, robotic surgery, 5G internet on a computer that fits in your back pocket. And imagine how differently we would have experienced the current pandemic had we not had technology to help us both communicate and especially vaccinate. What will the next 65 years be like? Today we are looking at the future of life from different perspectives. Will we be able to create life, protect it, improve it? But where do we draw the line? We will be discussing evolving technologies, the revolution of humankind, and the impact of progress on our planet and society. We will speculate, we will explore, and perhaps ultimately come to some joint conclusions. With polar explorer and climate journalist Bernice Notenboom, organic chemist and synthetic biology expert Wilhelm Huck, and philosopher and computational neuroscientist Anders Sandberg. They are joining us either here in the studio or online, and in 3 short presentations they will discuss principal developments from their areas of expertise and offer different views on our future. After this, in joint discussion, we will address questions and issues that you, the audience, can help us decide upon. So if you have any questions or comments to our speakers throughout the event, you can use the chat function on YouTube and Facebook, and we will make sure to include some of your questions in our conversation today. First, though, we move to Mentimeter, because we would also very much like to get to know you and hear about how you experience the future. Now, there is a link that you should see in the screen any moment now. The link is to the website menti.com, and you can see a code with numbers here that you can fill out, or if you look for a quicker way, you can go to the chat where there is a direct link to Mentimeter. As I said, we're interested to hear your views on the future, whether it is something that you look forward to or something that you dread. So our first question to you is, what are your expectations about your life 65 years from now? Now, of course, it also depends a little bit on what your current age is. So the first category is, in 65 years, I will be 80. I will be in my second youth and enjoying a vital life. I guess this is perhaps most applicable to the students watching. The second option is, I will exist as some form of cyborg or AI-enhanced life form. Or do you say, I will be preserved under cryo conditions and wait for science to bring me back to life at a later point in time? The fourth option could be that, I apologize for all my GIFs and references, but I just go crazy when I can do Mentimeter. But the fourth option is, you will just have died in 65 years. That's the truth of it. Or do you say, I will have vanished, but so will have the rest of humanity in 65 years. Of course, anything is really possible at this point. I see that the first responses are coming in, which are still for different categories. So I'm curious to see if we have a lot of students watching at the moment. No one is opting for the cryopreservation at the moment. Perhaps it's something we can discuss later. So far, one person is thinking that, the entirety of humanity will be wiped out in 65 years. Some of you hoping to go AI, enhanced. And of course, why would you not if the option is there? We have a short delay in the live stream, so I will see if we get a few more responses coming in. So far in the lead is humanity will be wiped out in 65 years. I'm curious to see if you will think the same at the end of this event. And that's still in the lead. Okay. Well, our second question has been drafted by our first speaker, Anders Sandberg. And perhaps we can go to that second question. And he's interested to hear about how probable you think life is on another Earth-like planet. Do you think it is 100% likely? Are you absolutely sure that it is possible that there is life on another planet? Do you think it's likely? Do you think it's unlikely? Or are you saying no way that there is life outside of planet Earth? And of course, this is a question that you can interpret in many ways. Either we, humans, colonize different planets, or there are circumstances under which life has been created on other planets as well. And I see so far, the majority believes that there's a 100% chance that there is a possibility of life on another Earth-like planet. While I give you a few more moments to answer, let me already introduce our first speaker, Anders Sandberg. We're very pleased that he can join us today online. He's a researcher, author, and transhumanist. He has a background in computer science, neuroscience, and medical engineering, and holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from Stockholm University. Currently, he's a James Martin Research Fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. His research interests, and I quote, include more or less everything: even to the extent, he is already nodding to me, even to the extent that he has written a paper titled, "What if Earth Turned into a Giant Pile of Blueberries?" So that might be something that you can look up after this event. But he's particularly interested in societal and ethical issues surrounding human enhancement and new technologies, global catastrophic risk, and very long-range future, hence the Mentimeter question as well. So Anders, I can see you're already joining me in the live stream. A very warm welcome to this event. Please tell us more about your research and also how you interpret the Mentimeter results. I can see the majority says likely that there is life outside of Earth.
Well, thank you very much for having me here virtually. And I find this study really interesting because in our era, it's fairly common to believe that life ought to be plentiful in the universe, which of course leads to an interesting question: where are the aliens? And disregarding maybe some blurry photos of UFOs from the American military, there doesn't seem to be that many aliens around, which seems to indicate something linked to the previous Mentimeter question. Maybe intelligence doesn't survive very long. So in some sense, if life is everywhere, that might be a very scary fact for us, because maybe there is something very bad about being an intelligent species we don't last. That is the kind of super big question we try to research at our institute. We're really trying to think about the fate of humanity questions, and are there ways of reasoning about them that are somewhat rigorous, or at least give us something we can do that is practical to improve our chances. So that's basically my interpretation of Mentimeter. I think we have an opportunity here to survive and become great cyborgs, or just having very much fun jumping around as a vital 8 years old. But there is a risk that we could go prematurely extinct because we flub it. And as I'm going to argue in my talk, that would be missing out on an enormous future. So generally, I don't know whether you're seeing my PowerPoint slide right now, or if you just see me hand waving. But my topic that I wanted to talk about was this classic, what is life? And people have been trying to define it for a long time, and it turns out to be surprisingly frustrating. In 1944, Erwin Schrödinger wrote this very famous book called What is Life?, which is a physicist's look on it. And he probably upset a lot of biologists who felt they knew what to say about it. The interesting part is, of course, that he actually did something very useful. He pointed out that in order for life to work, it needs to encode information about how to build new life. Somewhere inside biology, there has to be what he called an aperiodic crystal of information that allowed it to then make a copy. And this was before we had discovered DNA. He also made a very important point that life seems to be a thermodynamic system. The same rules that apply to steam engines and stars, of course, must apply to life too. It needs to have an energy flow in order to lower its own entropy, because otherwise it would decay and stop working. And since then, people have been applying various aspects of physics, information theory, automata theory, and chemistry to life, going way beyond what the traditional biologists would have said. And that leads to a whole host of fascinating questions about the nature of life, which I hope to show you that we can study life, we can learn important things about it, and it can give us some hints of where it might be going. So the first thing I mentioned was, of course, that life is a non-equilibrium process. So if we want to look for life out in the universe, we should look for planets that are not in a stable equilibrium. Earth is noticeably weird because we got free oxygen in the atmosphere. That's not a stable state. Something must be putting it there, and in our case, it's plants. If we find another planet where there is a chemical disequilibrium, unless there is some weird energy source pouring in the energy, we might want to say maybe there is life there. Conversely, if we find places where there is a lot of energy flow, they are good places to look for life, while places that are totally stable and have no energy flow are probably not very good places. Another interesting thing about life is, of course, that it reproduces. Self-replication means that one organism, or at least two organisms, can grow exponentially over time, which means that a very small beginning can reshape an enormous amount of matter. This is, of course, what happens in that coral reef I have in my slide. A few cells started at some point, and a few billion years later, we end up with a life that can actually take enormous amount of carbonate from seawater and build entire islands. They can take carbon dioxide and dissolved minerals and turn them into enormous kelp forests and the schools of fish. And indeed, if you look at Earth, you will see that it's been reshaped by life. And that exponential growth, of course, means that in the long run, if life gets a chance, it can totally transform its environment. Another aspect is, of course, that it's carrying information, but the information can get distorted by noise. It reproduces, and some of the variations are more successful than others. That leads to evolution, which might be a central thing to define life well. Now, the interesting part here is that our DNA is in some sense a map of reality. Throughout the past few billion years, cells have been trying all sorts of things accidentally, and some of these things were very successful, like photosynthesis or forming fishes that form schools together. Those fishes, those cells survived well, while the loner fishes got eaten by sharks, and the cells that didn't get energy, they died out. So gradually a map of physical and biological reality has been built into our genome. And this is full of various strategies for survival, including, of course, new tricks for evolving. Sex is an invention that is probably about 1.5 billion years old, or maybe a bit older. And that was a way of transmitting information more efficiently. Even more recently, we invented nervous systems. I'm saying we here as a representative of living beings. And the Beatles behind me and me, we're all enjoying, well, I am enjoying, my Beatles are unfortunately dead right now, the benefits of being able to adapt to an environment faster than evolution. And one of the most interesting things about life is also that it's non-ergodic. The number of possibilities is so vast that only a minuscule fraction will ever get realized across the history of the biosphere, no matter how many beetles or cells are trying to evolve. This means that everything is contingent. It could be different. It's path dependent. It could have gone a different way. If the asteroid had not killed the dinosaurs, we would probably be sitting here with feathers or scales. And it could be totally different in different ways. If you rerun evolution, you would get a different world. And this means also that many of things that we use in statistical mechanics, that those forms of averaging don't work on life. Life creates structures that are irreversible and random and yet very meaningful because we're tied to the environment. Now, what we humans do is, of course, we take it to the next level. We are in a kind of continuing this long evolution in interesting ways. Now, the thing is, we are also having a weird effect that we're impairing our own ability to research the origin of life. This might sound very backwards, and it actually is. If you look at the history of Earth, life seemed to have emerged really early. And you might say, that's good evidence that life is probably pretty easy. As soon as you got oceans, some slime started reproducing. Life ought to be in other oceans on other planets. But not so fast. The problem is, the Earth is also unique, as far as we know, by having observers, namely us. We couldn't exist on a lifeless planet. So suppose life is super hard, but almost no planet in the universe has it. That means that the even more rare observers would all find themselves on a planet. And life must, of course, have appeared long before them. But if there's also other hard steps, like inventing a good genetic code that is good for evolution and doesn't get stuck too much, and inventing eukaryotic cells that are effective at taking up nutrients and functioning in a way, inventing sex to spread information around, or nervous systems, or even language. If all of these tricky steps have to happen before each other, that might mean that the observers tend to find themselves at the end of a habitable period of their planet's lifetime, while they will see that life emerged early. So our own existence might actually imply not so much that life is everywhere, but that life might be very rare. This is just an observer selection effect. It could be, of course, that life is super common and most observers find themselves on planets early in their history. But then we should ask ourselves, does that seem likely given that we are fairly late in the history of Earth? So this is, of course, really interesting when we're asking the question, are we alone in the universe? Is there other intelligence, maybe smarter or wiser than us? Or is the silence in the sky a hint that, we might be doomed? Now, the good news is the harder life is, the more we should be shrugging at the empty sky. It just means that, yep, the universe is pretty empty and it's up to us and the rest of the biosphere to try to fill it. If, on the other hand, we believe that life really was easy, then we would need to explain why it looks so empty. Now, we are, of course, also a slightly weird species. When we think about what we're doing, we have a particular survival trait, and that is our intelligence and our ability to communicate is supercharging evolution. We're letting our own ideas die instead of us ourselves. I'm considering what I could do, and then if that seems to be stupid, I don't do it. I can try a lot of scenarios, and the interesting effect is I can then tell these scenarios both what to do and what not to do to others. And if it's a really good idea, they will tell more people. It might be spread across generations. And that is why we, unique among all species on the planet, have a cumulative culture. That's, again, just like any other form of exponential growth, at the start it was very minor. A better way of napping flint, a better way of hunting, a little bit better way of comforting kids when they're lonely. But gradually we spread these ideas. We built on them. We invented better ways of getting food. There was more people. More people meant more ideas were generated. We invented agriculture. Much more people. Enough food to actually have priests thinking about things that were not directly survival oriented, having armies that conquered other people, coordinating us in larger groups. And gradually this led to this current situation after the Industrial Revolution and the post-industrial revolution, where the technosphere is dominating the planet. Unfortunately, we're not very wise, so we're making a mess of a lot of things. But it's worth recognizing that although humans are still a fairly small fraction of the total biomass, our technosphere actually weighs more, it seems, than the biosphere. You might argue, yeah, most of it is concrete and stuff like that, so that doesn't count. But then again, a lot of the biosphere is wood, and it's also not doing terribly much. The interesting, really living parts is a much more small fraction. You could argue that there is tremendous biological diversity out there, but it turns out that the Amazon catalog actually has more entries than there are known or expected species. That might not mean that all the gadgets you can buy online have a greater moral value than a species. But we certainly have been generating a lot of complexity here. We can create long causal change that produce low probability events. That's really what intelligence is all about. I want something, I press a button, and because of a careful setup of electricity and silicon, something gets bought from an online store and delivered to me. The problem here is, of course, we are not terribly good at understanding the full consequences, because some button pressing might launch missiles, some button pressing is causing economical crisis. Now, the interesting part is, of course, we are also aware of it. Ants might reshape the environment and the savanna, but we never consider whether they're producing problems. Termites produce methane emissions, but we don't know about climate change. They can't conceptualize it. We are starting to get aware that we're making a mess of things and are trying to take steps to fix it, stumblingly and haltingly. But that is why I have quite a lot of hope that the Anthropocene might end in a very positive way. I do think that we actually are free to set up new trajectories for life on Earth. This is a tremendous moral responsibility, and we need to make choices about where we want to go. Maybe we say, okay, let's rewild the planet. Let's try to restore it to like it was before humans started dominating it. Of course, some of us might ask, how far back? 10,000 years? 100,000 years? Maybe going back to the dinosaurs? We might also say, well, actually, nature is good, but we could make it better. I want fluorescent beetles. I totally know that we should be able to make green fluorescent protein expressed in beetle shields. There are no such beetles yet, but if I get my way, maybe we will have that. There might be other ways of improving nature, which might not just be good for us, but in some sense good for nature. At this point, we get into some very funny ethical discussions about the inherent value of organisms and what we may and may not do to nature. We might also create artificial systems rivaling biology in complexity, whether they're synthetic biology or artificial intelligence. And I do think we have an interesting chance to remake the universe. Earth, after all, is the only planet that is launching objects into space. And I do think intelligent life represents a very peculiar phase transition of matter in the universe. In some sense, normal baryonic matter, under some circumstances, is unstable to be turned into bacteria that evolve into multicellular life, that evolve in intelligent life, that might then build spacecraft, mining space habitats, and reshape the universe. I've been working a little bit on the question of just how far could we go if we really wanted. And it turns out that the answer on how far we could spread life and the human or post-human settlements is literally a fair fraction of the visible universe. If we were to play our cards right, we could actually go literally 4.9 gigaparsec away. That's more than 12 billion light years. We're talking billions of galaxies that humanity or its successors could touch. That is really amazing. But even more amazing is that this is not just putting a little settlement on a planet. This might be reshaping planets, reorganizing matter into Dyson shells that collect energy for various forms of computation or communication or other uses. It might mean moving stars and galaxies against the expansion of the universe to make hyperclusters that are more stable. Whether this is a good idea or not depends very much on your value theory. And we're going to have some thousands of years to debate that before we maybe really have to decide what to do with it. But the point is, physics allows intelligent life to remake and rearrange the universe on a scale that's actually larger than the so-called end of greatness scale in astronomy. This is a scale, about 200 megaparsec, that denotes where the universe is more or less homogeneous. The galaxies form clusters and the voids and filaments that eventually average out. We don't believe in current cosmology that there are bigger structures. But intelligent life, if it set out to really do it, could create structures on larger scales. And that is a pretty amazing phase transition. Now, we are just at the start of its history. We are a young civilization barely out of the caves, and we could potentially have a really vast and grand future. Not just us, but life. We could spread life to the stars. And we could stumble today and lose it all. On the other hand, if we survive and thrive and spread, we might end up engineering a vast range of scales. And the fun part is, it's a choice. It's up to us. And this is, of course, where we get to be heroes if we make the right choice. Thank you.
Anders, thank you very much. Thank you for your insights and also for shedding some light on the really large scales that we could be thinking about when we think about the future. We have a question from you, from Professor Vincent Muller from the TUE.
Hi, Anders. It's of course somewhat odd that we should do this conversation now over pre-recorded videos when not that long ago we could have done that just chatting across the room in the same office. But okay, we'll do our best. So you outlined this really interesting, very long-term perspective on humanity, and I think that is very important for us to understand, because literally it gives us that perspective. So it has definitely its justification in its own right. But beyond that, I wonder whether you have any insights that might be relevant for something that is closer to my heart, which is artificial intelligence and how we should deal with this. In AI, there is of course a reasonable understanding of really long-term problems that we might be facing, particularly existential risk. And there is an understanding of what are the problems that we're facing now, even though I think they're poorly understood. I wonder whether your kind of perspective could shed some light on what might be called the medium term. So the kinds of problems that are not yet there, but that are visible on the horizon. So it would be interesting whether you could tell us your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Vincent. It's a great question, because I do think it's important to realize that the far future and the near future, they are, of course, connected. And sometimes thinking about the extreme far future can give us ideas about having near-term problems, and vice versa. The midterm problem, I think, is most important, is handling uncertainty in the right way. Well, many of the scary scenarios about superintelligence doing bad stuff also show up when you have just smart systems behaving in a very machine-like way. And many of them seem to boil down to being too certain about something. You can imagine the paperclip AI in saying, I'm certain the human wanted me to make a maximum number of paperclips. In reality, when I get a stupid command from somebody, I will say, what did he really mean? Okay, that seems to be confused. I'm going to totally try to interpret it better. But I might also ask, did you really mean that? And I think managing uncertainty is also the way we might want to get to the long run future. We want to keep options open. Biology is amazing at handling uncertainty because it's so robust. Many of the processes are going wrong every second in every cell. But there is error checking, there is correction, and sometimes sloppiness works. I think we need to build systems that are better at handling uncertainty and sloppiness. And that, I think, is where my perspective might be slightly useful.
Thank you very much for answering this question. We will see you back in the discussion. I have just one short question to you before that time. How would you answer our first Mentimeter question? Where do you think your life will be like in 65 years?
The uncertainty answer is probably a pretty good one. I'm giving a fairly equal probability between all of them. I'm actually signed up for cryonics, so I might actually really be in liquid nitrogen at that point. So I'm kind of thinking they're all quite likely. Some of them, unfortunately.
Okay, that's a very scientific answer, I have to say. Spreading the odds. Okay, great. Thanks for now, Anders, and we'll see you back in a few minutes. But first, we move on to our second speaker, Bernice Notenboom. She's a polar explorer, climate journalist, author, and filmmaker. She has over 20 years' experience fighting against climate change, and she reports about this through lectures, books, expeditions, television programs. She has taken high-profile CEOs to trips to the Arctic to increase awareness about climate change, and she's currently finishing her film project, Sky Gods, about the price of our love for flying. And as you can see, she is joining me in the studio today, which is of course great. Thank you for now. We see you back at the panel as well.
Yeah.
And we move on to our third speaker, Wilhelm Huck, who is also joining us online from Nijmegen. He's a professor of physical organic chemistry at the Institute of Molecules and Materials of the Radboud University. And before that, he was a professor and director at Cambridge University. In 2016, he was awarded the Spinoza Prize, which is the highest award in science in the Netherlands. And with his research group, he addresses several of life's key questions. What is life? How does it work? And where could it possibly originate from? The ultimate goal of his group is a bottom-up construction of life. And he has also prepared a Mentimeter question for you that you can now see in the screen and on your Mentimeter. And his question to you is, can machines be alive? Do you think yes, no, or maybe? And while you take a moment to answer this question, I can also tell you that Wilhelm has a rather successful second career because of Corona as host of the YouTube series Late Night Conferences with Wilhelm Huck. So if you're interested in hearing more about his work and the work of his colleagues, check it out on YouTube. I see we have some answers coming in, which are very evenly spread at the moment. So can machines be alive? Some of you say no and maybe are too close to call for me at the moment. Only a few of you are saying yes. Okay, well, we will get back to this question also at the end of Wilhelm's presentation. So for now, the winner here in my studio is no. So machines cannot be alive. Wilhelm, I hope you can join me in the live stream. And then I would say the floor is yours. We look forward to hearing your research about the origins of life.
Yes, I am very much interested in origins of life. What is life? Where does it come from? And ultimately, of course, can you actually build it? And today I thought I will talk about towards a synthetic cell. Can we build something that resembles a living cell as we all know them? And of course, the first thing you would say is that you would say, well, haven't we already seen that? Haven't we already seen synthetic cells. And you probably are aware of the work that Craig Venter and the Craig Venter Institute have done in the last decade or so, where they published a couple of breakthrough landmark papers, I would say, on the creation of a bacterial cell controlled by a chemically synthesized genome. And they call that the JCVI SYN1A and SYN3 Nord, that only has 473 genes and is the smallest living organism. And you would say, well, if that already exists, then why would I still be interested in building a synthetic cell? Well, there could be many ways of me trying to explain that to you, but I think the best way is to first start looking at that actual title. It says creation of a bacterial cell controlled by a chemically synthesized genome. Is that right? It's a catchy title, but let's have a look at more detail. Actually, chemically synthesized genome, I'm not so sure. Actually, it was yeast that synthesized the genome. It was humans and a DNA synthesizer that constructed the fragments of DNA that were fed into yeast, and eventually yeast created the whole genome. But let's not be picky about that. Let's have a look at the creation of the bacterial cell. And you would say that is a landmark achievement if you can do that, but actually the synthetic DNA was inserted in a living cell, transplanted, and then when the cell was dividing, that foreign DNA, that foreign genome took over and eventually created a synthetic cell controlled by this synthetic genome, but the cell was there all along. So really what we have is a bacterial cell controlled by a synthetic genome. And that means that actually we haven't quite created a bacterial cell here. We have really used an existing cell and modified it with a synthetic genome. And so what we really would like to do is build the cell from the bottom up. And that cell, well, how is it going to look like? Well, hang on, I can't see this one on my screen, but I hope you see the artist's impression of E. coli now, where you say, well, that is a complex-looking organism, of course. You see many different things. The swirly bits in the middle are the DNA. You see the cell membrane. You see many different proteins in there, and you think, that looks a bewildering array of different molecules that all have to be assembled together into a living structure. Actually, if you say, if I want to create this, then the complexity of the numbers and the parts is not really limiting. We know how to build an aeroplane. We know how to build a Large Hadron Collider, and we can build these machines, and they do exactly what they are supposed to do. They fly, or they find the Higgs boson. So if we then look at the number of components that we have inside E. coli, then the number of molecules is not really the limiting factor. We know how many molecules there are in the membrane. We know how many molecules there are in terms of proteins, in terms of the length of the genome, of the DNA, the RNA molecules, etc., etc. So you could say, to a certain extent, I could simply buy or make all these ingredients, lay them out on the table, and then I could start assembling. And if E. coli is too big for you, then you can say, well, I can first reduce the number of components that I have and say, well, and this is not me who has done this, George Church, who will be speaking at the Technical University in Eindhoven very shortly, I think, has actually published a paper some 15 years ago, where he has sort of made a minimal list where he said, well, what do you really need to make a synthetic cell? And he took essentially a schematic picture and he said, well, you need, of course, DNA, and you need to have something that replicates DNA. Fair enough. You need to translate the RNA into to RNA, the DNA into RNA, and the RNA into proteins. And the proteins that you make, they probably do need to make specific building blocks. And you need to make lipids, etc., etc. And so it sounds like a very difficult task, but actually in the end, he said, you probably need about 151 genes. So this is even much smaller than the minimal genome that Craig Venter and his team made that had still 473 genes. It looks also much smaller than what Mycoplasma, the smallest free living organisms, have, so it's about 1,000 genes, or E. coli, 4,000 to 5,000 genes. So you really say, well, shouldn't this be a rather trivial task? Well, first of all, a little detail. One of the key machines in any living system is a ribosome. The ribosome is the molecular machinery that translates the information that has gone from DNA onto RNA into functional proteins. So it's the ribosome. It consists of a couple of parts of RNA and some proteins. Unfortunately, nobody has ever been able to construct a functional RNA in vitro. So that is a big problem. And so in the end, the major problem, though, is that not it is difficult to make the parts. The really difficult part is that life is not a machine. And so if it were a machine, then we would have built it by now. This is the Large Hadron Collider. It was built up by just taking all the different components and essentially having a blueprint on how you build a structure like this. So it's almost like you go to IKEA and you sort of buy a bookshelf, and after a lot of sweat and tears and a whole weekend lost, you probably have something that resembles a bookshelf because it comes with instructions. Life, we know the parts, but we don't know the instructions. And so, sorry, engineers, and I think the slide has been a bit messed up on the ticker here. I didn't want to ruin your birthday, engineers in Eindhoven, but it's not a machine. We cannot build life. And so we have to find another way to really say, how do we go from a non-living system to a living entity? The main reason is that we cannot really build this living system is because life is something very different than when you look at it from the outside. When you look at the inside, and I hope you can see this slide, then you see a clue of chemical reactions, where each of the dots that you see here is an enzyme, tiny little molecular machine, and each of the dots between is a conversion of a substrate into a product, where the product is a substrate for the next protein. And so what you have is you have a complex system where everything works together and eventually allows E. coli to be E. coli. But the problem is we have no idea how a system like this works and how to put this together. It is almost the same as saying, well, if you take another kind of example like this, is we know that all the nerve cells in your brain together create the consciousness that allows you to think about who you are. And we understand how individual brain cells work, and we understand that they are connected to one another. But we have no idea how we can build a brain, and we also have no idea how this brain, with all its billions of connections, actually creates consciousness and creates you. And so that very same problem we also have at the very fundamental part of any living system. We simply don't know how the components that we understand reasonably well together create something that is much more complex than any of the components that we put in. And so that is the key reason why we are so interested in understanding how chemical systems create something that is not chemical, it's biological. So where is this very transition happening? Now, how do we study this? Well, one of the ways to study this is, of course, by studying living systems. And typically, we are very good at killing living systems and take them apart and see how they function. So what we really want to do is we don't want to kill the living systems, we want to build them up. So we want to go in the opposite direction there. And to make it a little bit more sort of plastic clear, we know how to go from chicken to chicken soup, but how do you go in the other direction there? Now, we actually have a large consortium in the Netherlands that is working on this very question. And it says, well, how are we going to do this? Well, what we really need is we need compartments. Because if we don't have a compartment, every living system has a compartment. It's called a cell. If we don't have that, it just washes away. Now, another thing, and I think I heard that already earlier in Anders' talk, is that we need Darwinian evolution, or we need at least information carrier. So we need DNA, and we need to go from the DNA to the RNA to the proteins. That's the central dogma of biology. If you want to do all these things, well, you need building blocks and you need energy, because life is a system that is constantly out of equilibrium. It constantly consumes energy. For that, you need metabolism. But for metabolism and also for replication, as we have seen with the ribosome, we need enzymes, we need catalysts. And so the catalysts, of course, are encoded by the DNA, but everything else was held together by the compartment. So all of these things, they all need to come together in a way at the same time, forming a functional system. And as I said before, we don't really know how to do this. We know what is on the shelf, but how do we now put that together? As I said before, we have a consortium in the Netherlands. It's called Building a Synthetic Cell, BASIC. It's only 20 million euros, 10 years. So for such a daunting, ambitious plan, that's probably not going to be enough, but it's a combination of people doing chemistry, biochemistry, physics, biophysics, microbiology, theory, simulations. And our goal is to build a living cell from its components. And I appreciate this is very much a sort of a Humpty Dumpty story, right? We are all the king's men, putting Humpty back together again. I just told you before that we cannot really do that, because I told you it's not a machine. And so you might argue that sounds like a fruitless exercise. Why are you trying to do something like that? Well, I think it's still a reasonable thing to do. Let me give you one glimpse on how we think we are going to do that. I'll come back to that, the question of why we would do that in a second. So we said, well, if we can try and put a minimal cell together, let's take a minimal cell. So we are taking in our labs the minimal cells, the minimal genomes that come out of the Craig Venter lab in La Jolla, and we use these to build our minimal cell. So what do? You take the minimal organisms, you smash them apart, you make a cell lysate, a soup, and then you try and put it back together again in a synthetic compartment and allow that synthetic compartment essentially to rebuild the synthetic cell. So in the lab, that looks like you are going to use cell lysate. Oops, my apologies. I was going too fast there. You take cell lysate, you use fancy microfluidics to try and reconstruct liposomes, cell-like structures that contain all the ingredients that you have just taken from the synthetic organism, and then you put it back together again, and you hope that this now is a synthetic compartment with a minimal mycoplasma lysate and a minimal genome. That genome comes to expression and starts to rebuild its own sort of minimal cell from scratch. So that's what we would like to do. I told you before, this is a very ambitious plan that might well fail. So why would you do it? Because I just told you that life is not a machine, even though René Descartes thought so several hundred years ago. So we have moved on from this reductionist approach to life. Still, I think by doing this, it is very much in Feynman's spirit: what I cannot build, I do not understand. So we know that we don't understand it. We know that we cannot build it. But in trying to do so and failing, we understand where we're going to fail. And from our failures, we can learn. And so what do we want to learn? Well, I think we want to see how much of a blueprint there is towards the synthetic cell. How much can we really learn from this? What is the role of the physical appearance of a cell? All cells are small, highly condensed, this genome in the middle. Is there a reason for that? How to put it up? Once you have your synthetic cell, will it just start automatically? Will you need to have a little program of genes that start running the engine, and then everything else starts? And in the end, what does it really mean if the cell becomes alive? And the final question, of course, is that if we have this synthetic cell approach, can we ultimately think that there is some kind of formula of life? And if there is a formula, some mathematical description, then it goes back to my original question about the Mentimeter question about can a machine be alive, if we have an algorithm that says if you do this, that, and the other, you will end up with a system that we can call alive, then we can start thinking about maybe building machines that are alive. Can we really do this? I don't know. At the moment, we only know one form of life, and that is the life that we see around us. But maybe you have changed your opinion and you start thinking in a different direction. I thank you all for listening, and I'll switch back to the studio.
Wilhelm, thank you very much. I see that some people are answering the Mentimeter question. So if you would like to comment after Wilhelm's talk and see if perhaps your opinion about whether machines can be alive or not has changed, please answer the Mentimeter. For now, there are a few people saying they don't believe a machine can be alive, Wilhelm. And we have a question for you from our researcher, Ghislaine Van Tomme.
Good afternoon. My name is Ghislaine Van Tomme, and I'm assistant professor of organic chemistry at Eindhoven University of Technology. Wilhelm, thank you for the very inspiring lecture. And I'd like to ask you, today we will know how to make life. What will we use it for? Thank you.
Yeah, Ghislaine, that's an excellent question, and that's what people often ask. Personally, I think the real question that we are trying to address is how do you go from dead to alive? And I appreciate that if you are at an engineering school, then you say, well, what can we do with that? I would say you're not going to do anything with that synthetic cell. You just maybe put it in a frame and put it on the wall, or you just put it in the bin because you don't know what is going to happen with it. But it's really the knowledge about being able to build a cell and understanding how you do this that is really very valuable. Because having that knowledge will also tell you something about existing cells and why they function in the way they do and why they sometimes don't function in the way they do. So if you think about disease, if we understand how we build a cell, we also understand why some cells are diseased. And that would give us a completely new approach to thinking about how we design new medicine, new molecules that can help you fix the cell, not by fixing a part, but by fixing the system as a whole. So that's what I hope that we can do with our synthetic cell.
Okay, Wilhelm, thank you very much. And thank you for your presentation. That means that it's now time for a discussion. And I'm also joined again here by Bernice and by Wilhelm and Anders in the live stream. And of course, first of all, I'm curious to hear you all come from very different backgrounds. We've now heard 3 different stories about the future. How do you look at each other's stories? And maybe I can start with Anders because you were our first speaker. What are your impressions so far?
So I think our stories fit together in an interesting way because I was sketching out the big abstract model and then of course pointing out, well, we better not flub it here at the start. We better not fry ourselves or crash our biosphere before we have a chance to do something awesome with it. And the nature of life itself, being able to create lifelike systems for whatever purpose, I think is very important, both for our ability to actually change the world. Self-replicating technology is probably key to rearranging the universe on a large scale. But even more importantly, managing complex, uncertain, robust systems is something we really need to do in order to build economies and technologies and ecosystems that we can actually live with.
So we have, of course, Bernice's story, which is compared to the very large timescales that you look at, is very short and urgent timescale. Is that also a system?
Oh yeah. The climate system is fascinating, and often people ask me, so you do a lot of research about existential threats to humanity. Why don't you talk more about climate? And I used to say, yeah, actually, climate is not that deadly compared to some of the other horrible stuff. But I changed my tune a bit because climate is a driver of systemic risk. It's not that climate itself would kill us, but a world that has real trouble with agriculture, where a lot of people are getting displaced, that's going to be a violent place. That's going to be a place where there are a lot of economic pressure and hard political decisions to make, while powerful technologies like artificial intelligence and biotechnology are coming in play at the same time. That's not a good place to be. You want to make sure that at least the climate drivers don't make the world even worse. And understanding how different kinds of systems link to each other, I think, is the key part here. For example, I'm rather hopeful about sustainable energy now because of solar panels and wind power doing amazing things. But for a long time, we had good reasons to be fairly pessimistic because they only started taking off really properly over the last 20 years. It's very hard to predict technologies like this, and that's why we might need to front load them even before they look promising.
Can I check with you, Bernice, if you're equally optimistic about the developments that Anders just paints a picture of?
I couldn't hear everything what he was saying, so but
I say in the last 20 years, Anders, if I summarize correctly, you say we've seen a lot of progress in terms of solar panels, and that's something that's hopeful to you.
Yeah, it doesn't fix the full climate problem, certainly not, but it's fixing part of it.
Yeah. No, I'm very optimistic. Of course, we're all aware, and when we look back at the last 50 years, or well, 20 years, to keep to the 20 years, lots of progress have been made. But I think we all know it's not going fast enough, and we need really, really different kind of leadership. And, we're hearing a lot about system change. And that is one of the things we really should look at and examine, because the people that are in power, our leaders at the moment, really just want to do one thing, and that is business as usual, continue. And so that with the new generation coming, students at the TU here, I mean, it was in the newspaper the last couple of days. Your dream employer, even when I was a student, was Shell. Well, today that's a swear word. You don't want to be working for Shell anymore.
There are definitely mixed feelings right now when it comes to Shell.
I mean, there is already a huge change, and a lot of the young people, students, want to be in the renewable energy world. So that's really good. But we all know the people that make the decisions are the people of my generations. And so the younger generation really need to move very speedy. And a good way of doing that would be to elect them in board of directors in big corporations and really make sure that their voices are heard.
It's interesting you say this, because there was also a comment during your talk from someone actually with regard to the Mentimeter statements who said, I suspect the people in power will just not care if they think scientists will not have a solution. So
if they are listening to scientists, I mean, in the United States,
that's the first step, I guess. Yeah,
scientists have to be taken serious, and in the United States, that has been a long problem. We have a change of leadership, which is great, and we've seen what Biden has been doing with the pandemic. It's fantastic. If it's true that he's really want to have everybody driving an electric car, despite how we're going to get the materials, of course, there's always plus and minuses about our resources. But say if that is really going to happen, things can happen very, very fast with the right amount of leadership. And then people have faith, and then they want to invest, and that it will all create. That's all positive. And I think that's where it has to start. We have to really look at that.
Okay, thanks. Wilhelm, of course, you're in a slightly different field of study, but do you see any parallels with the very small scale that you work on and the very big system that we look at, and we look at climate change and even longer changes that are ahead of us?
Yeah, to a certain extent, of course, I do, because I think in both cases it's a complex system. And so it's a complex system even of actually molecules and reactions between molecules. If you think about the reactions that take place in the atmosphere, that ultimately make climate. And so I think in all of these cases, and it doesn't have to be molecular, it can also be energy transition, is also a complex system where there's many things interacting, and you cannot predict where a complex system is going to end up. So you can try and nudge it by setting the right boundary conditions, and that is probably what Bernice was calling leadership. But I don't think you can exactly predict where it is going to end up. So what we can do is we can study complex systems, and we can try and learn more about their typical dynamic behavior. And I think in that case, small systems at the molecular scale or big systems at the social or entrepreneurial scale have similar kind of characteristics and similar kind of mathematics to describe them. So in that respect, all these fields are linked together.
Okay, thanks, Wilhelm. There's also a question for you with regard to our Mentimeter statement, it is difficult for scientists to figure out whether viruses are alive or not, so let alone robots. So maybe this is an interesting point to discuss a little bit more about what life actually is. So how do you look at viruses compared to robots to start with?
Viruses are not alive, so full stop. No discussion.
Full stop? Okay, no discussion?
That's me saying this. I know that there is discussion, but since you asked me and there's nobody else in the room, I can say that.
Well, I'm happy to take the opposite side.
It's not, because if you think about it, the virus is a little machine. There's nothing going on, right? So it's just molecules waiting for the right sort of moment to run their program. So it's a little package of potential. But it's not a system that derives energy from its environment, that takes building blocks from its environment, that can grow, that can divide and sort of replicate itself. So there's a lot of parts of replicating itself, but that's not quite what we're talking here. It doesn't do that autonomously, so it can only do that as part of a host. So the virus itself is not alive, I would say. What you would say,
a lot of havoc for something that's not alive, you could say.
It's an inherent byproduct of life. That's what a lot of people think. So it's parts that come off living systems and start sort of. So people think it's a very essential part that it has played in evolution, where life has constantly tried to fight against the viruses and found new ways of evading them or fighting back against them. And viruses have become ever more adept at finding new ways of invading living systems. So you could say there's a bit of an arms race that has definitely led to a new type of evolution. So in that respect, they are tightly sort of tied to living systems.
Okay, so then I'm curious to hear maybe from Anders, because of course you also think a lot about what is life. Having heard Wilhelm's story, do you recognize the difficulty in saying when something actually has become alive and whether it's the system?
Yeah, in the long picture, I think we need a better term for lifelike things, because we are not going to really agree on whether viruses or self-replicating robots or maybe even economies are alive. I think saying that it has to have a metabolism is making a little bit narrow, because there are many bacterial spores that are sitting around. And maybe we can argue that they're not alive while they're not having a metabolism, but once they start growing, then they become alive. But I think in general, there are always going to be these messy cases. Philosophically speaking, life is a vague concept. It's not that vague compared to many other important philosophical concepts, but it is always going to have this weird gray zone. And I do think living systems are always going to generate challenges for our definitions. We are going to get meta-organisms, where you have various individuals forming larger organisms. You get things like humans generating artificial systems, and we might generate artificial systems that are intelligent and can survive in space and are using solar panels, but we don't have any biological metabolism. Yet we might say, we need a big category to encompass both the robots and our life. And then, of course, we might have a real problem if we find some weird crystals on Pluto doing some kind of solid state life. But in the end, of course, defining life itself is more an exercise of understanding what's going on here. What kind of systems have what properties? So I think evolution and information storage and being able to open-endedly change is the important thing. But metabolism is rather important when eating.
Do you think there can be a little bit of life?
I think we can have a continuum. Yeah, I don't think it's binary. I think viruses are way less alive than the cells. But then again, there are some cells that might not be very alive because they're always parasitical. I think, however, this is not something we're going to resolve. This is something kind of philosophers of biology and biologists are going to be happily bickering about forever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Bernice, how do you look at this discussion about sort of the essence of life from starting from the molecular level, or is it something that you protect on a very large scale?
Well, I'm thinking when I was listening to this conversation, is like we have to come up with something to really protect our climate, and that would be, of course,
priority number one.
Yeah, priority number one. But also, if we, there's a lot of talk that we as humans we just cannot get it together anyway. So we might as well just really embark into the unknown terrain of geoengineering. And then I'm coming a little bit in your thinking, particularly Willem, and that would be of interest to me. There's of course a lot of geopolitical issues associated with it, and that's a whole nother topic. But I mean, we may have to think about that, and I would be curious. A question for me to both of you: if we could save our planet, our climate, with your expertise, if you can think of one application that we could really, we can develop and implement. Can I not do that? Ask them a question.
Yes, of course. Who would like to answer first?
Well, I can try. To me, that sounds like a really dangerous thing to try. As I just mentioned, climate is a complex system. And so what you do know from complex systems is that you don't know where they will end up. So you cannot predict them. What you do know for sure is that once they go to a certain place, you cannot just go back by retracing your steps. And so this is, I would say, one of the key bits of the climate change is that it's not so bad to maybe go to 4 degrees and then know how you work your way back to 1.5 degrees. The problem is that we don't know where to go back. We just know that we are then stuck at 4 degrees, and hopefully that will be a stable, some kind of steady state climate, but we don't know, right? It might just run off and it might be 20 degrees. What we know for sure is that we just can't just cool it a bit, make an artificial ice cap, and then we go back to where we were. We know for sure that once we leave our current climate, it will just be gone and we can't go back. And I think that is the really scary part, because I think a lot of people think, well, it warms up a little bit and we find a way of cooling it a little bit and then we will be fine. I think that's not the case. So that's also why I would say these geoengineering approaches, I would say it's very risky because we don't really know whether we can just cool a bit and then we'll just end up where we were and we'll all be safe. So to me, that sounds a dangerous approach.
What is synthetic cell creating?
Approach, but for a different reason. So I'm more optimistic that we can actually understand climate. We might not be certain about it. There might be a great deal of risk involved, but I think we can actually say some things. The real problem, however, is that geoengineering, first of all, doesn't, at least in the traditional idea of shielding against sunlight, doesn't solve all the problems. Ocean acidification is a real problem, for example, for the coral reefs. And that's not going to be fixed, even if you nicely get the temperatures down. The better approach is, of course, finding good ways of absorbing a lot of carbon dioxide. So working on carbon sequestration, I think, is a way better form of geoengineering. And it might be possible to do that just by spreading out a lot of olivine in agricultural soil so it absorbs carbon dioxide. I see some interesting problems here about heavy metals from that. There might be technological methods that can be made cheap enough. I used to, again, believe that this is uneconomical, this can't be done. And some nice calculations done by more clever people than me convinced me, actually, it's not that far away. If we really push towards this, we can do it, especially if we start looking at molecular solutions and biological solutions and nanotechnological solutions. It looks like we could probably make that work to actually absorb carbon dioxide. However, that requires a big research push. It's not just something that's going to happen if we have business as usual, even in academia. So if people are serious about fixing climate change, it's not just renewable energy and maybe changing travel habits. We actually need a very serious push to absorbing carbon dioxide. But changing solar influx, it's going to always be risky and politically tricky because, of course, Bangladesh, if it's getting flooded and overheated, it might decide unilaterally to say, okay, we are going to increase the shielding, which as a Scandinavian, I'm not too happy about. And you have this unilateral curse situation. It's enough that one agency does that. So it might also be worth investigating ways of fixing the stratosphere if somebody unwisely puts stuff up there, which incidentally is also useful against nuclear winters, supervolcanic eruptions, and other things, which we also should be protecting ourselves against.
So you offer, Anders, a few solutions that tackle the problem, but you could also think the other way around and say we first need to change our baseline activities so that the problem will not arise, or will be less as it is now, which is, I think, something.
if we magically stopped emitting carbon dioxide at this very moment, we would still have a problem because there is a lot of carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere. We need to absorb that back. And we want to do that using relatively small amounts of energy, because otherwise it's going to be tricky. And it needs to be cheap enough so people will actually want to do it. Ideally, it should be kind of easy enough that it's also a cool thing to do. It's high prestige, or it's part of other activity we want. In that case, it's going to happen naturally. It's a bit like solar panels. Today, even climate denialists are putting solar panels on the roofs simply because it makes economic sense. We want to push carbon capture to that level.
Okay, Bernice, do you agree that all these developments are good, or would you say maybe we need something else as well?
Well, I like to really look at the psychology and why, because if we understand why we're not acting, then perhaps we understand ourselves and we can change our behavior. I mean, we've seen lots of examples lately that we can act if it's a crisis. Except we don't treat this as a crisis because it's still far away and it doesn't affect us, us in the Western world. And so once we understand the importance of it and the urgency, then we will act. And I think it will come, but the question is really at what cost? At what cost of loss of biodiversity, which we're already seeing every day, the effects of it. So, it's I saw this documentary in the United States not too long ago, and they say there's 100,000 people that died of COVID, that were unnecessary before they really got their act together, right? And it's sort of the same with climate change. We're going to have a lot of loss in ecosystems, in species, in flora, all the things. And at what cost are we then getting our act together? But that's probably what we're looking at, because we humans, and that's what I'm sort of pessimistic about, we just seem not to think about how to do it any sooner. This whole long-term thinking, 2 degrees in 2050. Who thinks about 2050? We have 30-year mortgages. We don't even comprehend 30-year mortgages, right? Mm-hmm. Most of us are thinking today, immediate. And that is what's so difficult about climate change. And that's why this whole COVID is so fascinating to see how we can act. And it gives me hope that we have seen examples that we can do things collectively. But this is a tough one. Yeah. So, yeah.
I have a question to Anders that's maybe a little bit out there, but you also work on cognitive enhancement, of course. Say we could program people in such a way that they are more aware of their future further ahead. Would this perhaps be a solution?
Perhaps. I think generally being long-term oriented is a good thing. Psychologists talk about construal theory, that when we think about stuff near us, we think about it very differently from things far away in time or space. And the problem is much of the future is something you think about like in a movie or something on television. It's not real. And then you think about your own home or what you need to do next week, and it's very real. And ideally you want to extend it. So earlier I mentioned that I'm signed up for cryonics, and I'm wearing this little tag with the instruction to freeze me if I'm dying. And I'm mostly doing that because it's a great conversation starter, because it brings the ridiculously far future and really weird questions into the present. And I think we need to do this. And sometimes cognitive enhancers might be the solution. Sometimes it might just be the right kind of institutions. And also I think life extension is actually having a positive effect. The longer we expect to live, the more we have to realize that, my retirement plans are going to be messed up by climate change. Yeah. That thought is useful. Having people realize, the mortgage of this house is going to be tricky because this area might get flooded. That is relevant. Suddenly the future becomes part of a normal reality. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned the longer people live, which is interesting, I think, also for Wilhelm, because, of course, if you are able to create life at some point, this would also mean a lot for human life, and perhaps for medication and for improving our body or whatever. Can you maybe speculate a little bit about that? About how do you think, how long will life last in the future?
That's pure speculation, of course.
You're allowed to today.
Yeah. I think I'm not an expert on the biology of aging, of course. I can just say that I think scientists have a natural curiosity to challenge assumptions, right? So your assumption at the moment is that you do die when you say 100 years old, and of course, if you say, well, that assumption might be wrong, I think it might be possible to live for 200 years. Then you're going to look at possible ways of extending your life to several hundred years. I think at the moment there is no way that we know how to do that. I think we don't even know where to start looking. On the other hand, it might be a way of just making sure we keep repairing you and fixing you until you do live for significantly longer than you do at the moment. So it might well be possible. I don't know. I'm not sufficiently expert to say that that is realistic at all. On the other hand, you say, why would it not be possible? Because there's such a diversity in lifespans among different living species that you would say, well, why could you not just extend that lifespan a bit further?
What do you think will be the impact of your research on life in general if you succeed in creating it?
I think it has a profound impact on society as a whole, I think, because typically you think about life as something that is, well, magic or holy or something that is unique in the sense that all life that we know comes from other life. And so every cell on Earth at the moment came from another cell. That came from another cell. That came from another cell. And so that is not just for humans that come from their parents, grandparents, etc., but goes for bacteria as well. And that is the world we live in. And we totally have absorbed that idea about life, that it is there and it passes on from generation to generation. If you then say, well, we could also just restart it essentially and make a new one, I think that's conceptually very, very different, and I would say has a big impact on the way we think about living systems.
Okay, thanks, Bernice. You were looking a little hesitant there.
Well, I was just doing the math in my head. If we're all going to live 200 years plus, the estimation of 10 billion on our planet, what kind of
that's the point, right? I think the point is not that we should live longer, but there should be a little bit fewer of us at some point in the future.
Yes. Well, do you have a solution for that?
Well, I think we don't want to speculate about those kind of solutions, right? So that's not good. So climate change would definitely limit the numbers at some point if that goes ahead. So,
well,
I think Anders is keen to respond.
Yeah, there is actually this paradoxical thing that if you think the world is dangerous and risky, typically people tend to have children at younger age. While if things are certain and safe, people tend to put them off having children. In fact, I would bet that in a climate changing world, fertility might unfortunately be higher than in a safe and staid world. Indeed, many countries are having a demographic problem right now because we're having under replacement rate reproduction. And that's partly because of other things we do. We know that our retirement is relatively secure. We don't need to have a bunch of people to ensure that we retire. I don't think necessarily life extension is going to be an overpopulation problem. In fact, if people live really long, they might put off having children way longer, maybe not have them at all. So we might still get an underpopulation problem. The demographics of life extension is really very little explored and surprisingly non-trivial.
Okay, thanks. I'm just taking a look here at the questions from the audience. If you have any questions, please use the chat to ask them to us. There's a question to you, Anders. Do you believe humans will be able to adapt even if the poles have melted? So in the worst case scenario of Bernice?
Yeah. Well, of course, a lot of humans would probably move up to Bolme, Svalbard, and enjoy Novalia Zemlya and kind of the beaches there. But humans are pretty adaptive, partially, of course, because we use technology to interface with the environment. David Deutsch, the great physicist, pointed out that even Oxford and Oxfordshire are not inhabitable by unprotected humans. We need clothes, we need homes, we need fires to warm ourselves. We can't actually survive naked in England. And this is true, of course, for almost any environment. So in a radically climate change world, people would adapt, probably by creating environments that are better for them, air-conditioned domes and things like that. That might not be a good thing because it's expensive. Not everybody might get a place on the inside. But it's totally doable. I don't think you would have humanity dying of heat stroke, but it would still be a bad scenario. You can also think about the Eocene heat maximum about 50 million years ago, where over a span of relatively short span, a lot of species became very small and adapted to the heat. I actually did some calculation how quickly humans would adapt, and it turns out that anthropogenic climate change is too fast for us to adapt this quickly. But in theory, we could. It probably is not what we should do. We should do it by fixing root cause much more.
Okay, thanks. Would you like to comment, Bernice?
Yeah, I agree. We can't adapt. It's going too fast. But it's interesting because there are pictures of Neanderthals, how they look like, right? And you're bringing up the point that humans didn't have fur. If we had fur, we could live in the Arctic, right? It's just like we don't have it. But we have seen adaptations to fingers and to feet, bigger feet, when people were living in areas where they had to use their hands and feet a lot more, that they actually were overdeveloped. And we know that above the Arctic Circle, there's people that have a reversed physiology. If they get cold, they put their hands and their feet in the water, and the water rushes from the heart to the fingers and to the feet to make them warm. If we do that, we do the opposite. It goes to our heart, and so we have cold fingers and feet. So there are already adaptations, but those are over generations, and the time frame that we're looking at, that's too fast. So technology will have to save us on that one.
Mm-hmm.
I see Wilhelm nodding as well. Would you like to add, Wilhelm, or you just
I think the big danger in climate change in the end might not be humans, but everybody else or every other species, because we can adapt using technology, but normal evolution cannot adapt so quickly.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, there's a question for you, Bernice. What is the best thing an individual can do to prevent melting? Stop eating fish, meat, stop flying, have no offspring. So quite someone looking for concrete advice, I would say. Yeah,
I know. I get that all the time. And it would be very hypocritical to say, okay, if you just use LED lights and you have your tires on the right pressure, you'll be fine. You save the planet. Because that's, of course, on an individual level, unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do. But what does help, and have we seen lots of examples of that? I mean, just think about the power of Extinction Rebellion. Think about Fridays for Climate, a movement. Think about all these spring off, these grassroots organizations that are starting and taking on governments and taking on businesses. And, if you just make a voice and unite and collaborate together, that really, I think, is the best thing to do. And of course, you need to do all the other things also, but you do them anyway. But I think we really need to let our voices hear, and then you can change the system from within. And yes, I mean, an airplane will still fly whether you're in it or not. They will just hike up the prices, and we know that that's going to happen. So that's, to me, is not where you're going to make an individual difference. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. There's a question to, I think, all three of you. If we would be able to solve the climate change issues, what might be the next big challenge in the future of humanity? Simple question. Tempted to go to others for this one. But.
So I think the big challenge right now is artificial intelligence. Right now, it's still kind of dumb as a mouse. But it's getting better and better at a fairly exponential rate. And there is no reason to think it's going to stop at a human level. At that point, it becomes rather important to make sure it's safe and aligned with human values. And yes, maybe this is not going to happen next decade, or maybe it's going to take 50 years or 100 years. But it looks like it's on its way. And that's going to be really important, because even if we fix climate change, if the world gets accidentally paved over by artificial intelligence misinterpreting what we want to do, we have still lost. On the other hand, if we manage to make intelligence something we can get on tap, something that we just have in the cloud and can connect to every device, suddenly many problems become way more solvable. So I think this is one of the big challenges. There are many others, but this one is particularly unusual because we're not good at thinking about it either. But It's different from climate. Climate is about coordination, about a sensitive, complex system. Artificial intelligence is coordination about a future technology that we don't fully understand.
Is it in that way perhaps similar, Wilhelm, to your work, which is very much on the biological level, that you are working on, as you had this very nice complicated picture of life and question mark? Yeah, if you think about what you might be able to discover, is it similar to this whole development with AI, where there's also a big black hole of knowledge that we don't know yet?
That could well be. I mean, sometimes I'm actually a little bit worried that at some point we find out that we can actually build a living system by somehow combining all the right ingredients in the right way. And we observe it and we conclude that we made a living system. And then when we look at it, we still don't understand, because it might be so complex that in the end, the only sort of system that can understand it is some artificial intelligence system that can think at a higher level, and that we ultimately will not be able to understand how it actually works. So that is a bit my sort of worrying view, where we might end up, because it is such a complex problem. I don't know. I think Anders was quite right on artificial intelligence. A run of artificial intelligence might actually be a huge problem if that really sort of develops in the wrong direction.
Okay, thanks. Maybe to kind of wrap up this discussion, and something that has been at the heart of this whole event, to what extent can we actually predict the future? We've asked you this, and you very bravely participated, all three of you.
I think the answer is we predict the future every day about everyday things. I know that if I go into my kitchen and turn the tap, there is most likely going to come out water. I know that if I do certain things on my computer, other things will happen. This is part of normal intelligence. It's just that when it comes to things that I don't have experience with, when we're actually talking about 50 years down the line, our predictions become much worse. And historically, people have also not really been very serious about making good predictions most of the time. It's been more entertainment or maybe calming us down. But I do think it's possible to make some predictions about the long-range future that are reliable and might be decision relevant. We know from astronomy that we can predict solar eclipses and where planets are because it's such a nice regular system. Now, we can't predict the weather because it's pretty chaotic, but we can actually make climate models which, although they're not giving us an exact temperature in 50 years' time, tell us roughly what's going on, and that's useful for making decisions that, we need to fix things. There are many domains we can figure out are predictable. There are also domains we know we cannot predict, like the stock market. It's anti-predictable. If you could predict it, you could make so much money that people would make use of those predictions to make money, and that removes the ability to predict the system. So there are some parts of the world we can predict. There are other parts that are uncertain, but we can still make guesses. We know that pandemics are possible. We just don't know when they will happen. So we need to prepare for that. So I do think we can learn things about the future that are useful right now to make ourselves safer, happier, and better off in the long run.
Okay, and then can I ask either Bernice or Willem, what do you hope to be most surprised about in the next 65 years?
Well,
I should go first. I thought you shouldn't make predictions, especially not about the future.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
I think you shouldn't try and make predictions, especially not about the future. But I think what Anders said is quite right. I think we are typically, when you ask us what will happen in the next 5 years, we are often over optimistic and think that we will be able to do a lot of things, and in the end we don't manage. But if you ask us what will happen in the next 10 or 20 years, we typically lack the imagination. We simply can't really foresee big changes, and I think that will continue to be so. So who could have? I mean, I can remember when the iPhone came, which is only just a decade or so ago, right? I remember I thought nobody would ever need an iPhone. Why would you need an iPhone? We were perfectly going along without smartphones. And all of a sudden, we can't do without one anymore. And that has changed our life completely, right? Those are actually small things in a way, but they have huge implications. And I think there will be continuous sort of developments like that will completely surprise us.
Well, my hope is that this whole year and a half of COVID have been really for a lot of us that are making big decisions, a wake-up call. And, we hear the terminology all the time, the Great Reset, building things back better. I see a little bit of that, at least in the climate discussions, but let's just really hope that we can sustain that and that we're not going to put it aside and forget about it. I mean, we do know that humans don't like to change, and that we look back a long time ago, we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. But perhaps now it is really in our faces, and everybody was affected, and we use this lesson to adapt into the future. That's what I'm hoping for. And there's good signs, so we have to just keep people reminding that this needs to happen. And then maybe in a year from now, we already make big waves and big steps.
Okay, so there's hope for change.
Yeah,
okay,
I'm hopeful.
brilliant. I think those are very nice words to conclude this discussion with. So Bernice, Anders and Wilhelm, thank you so much for joining us today for this event, Heroes in the Future. And thanks so much for stepping up and be willing to be these visionary heroes. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much at home for watching today and for joining in this discussion. I hope that you will feel inspired to work on a future that you are also happy to live in. If you are still thirsty for more visions on the future, the 65th anniversary of our university continues already next week during the Dutch Technology Week. And we will have on Monday an event about sex, robots and artificial intimacy. So I'm sure that will interest many of you. And we also have one of the few cyborgs in the world in our program on Wednesday for Studium Generale. And as Wilhelm already mentioned, on the 14th of June, George Church will make an appearance as well. The highlight of this anniversary year will hopefully be on the 15th of October. Corona Valente, of course. We hope there will be a big celebration back on campus together with you. For today, this is it from us here in the studio. We would like to thank everyone here, the Lustrum Committee, Full Frame for the technical support, my colleagues from Studium Generale. And then if you're a bachelor college student and you would like to register for use, you can now find the link in the chat. We hope you have a lovely afternoon and evening, and see you back on the Studium Generale and Eindhoven University of Technology channels. Bye!